Chapter 11 Scavengers. I'd left the training ground dripping in sweat. After my sparring match, I trained hard. I put on weights and practiced sword play to strengthen my arms further. Other boys drifted in and out of the grounds, but they all ignored me. Back in my room, I placed Jevon's sword back onto its shelf and quickly changed, heading to the dining hall for an early dinner. I hoped Jevon would be there so I could tell him about having to burn his notes. Jevon wasn't in the dining hall, but I sat in our usual spot, piling a steaming piece of fish and brown splay mushrooms onto my plate. I took a hearty slice, too, from a fresh loaf of root bread on the table. My stomach ached for food, and I ate as fast as I could. Taking a long draught of spiel fruit tea when I was finally partially satiated, I nearly dropped it when shouts started ringing through the hallway outside. Everyone rose as one and went to see what the noise was about. There was a small crowd outside the throne room and shouting coming from inside, but I couldn't see why. I squeezed through the swarm of people, hardly noticed as everyone's eyes were fixed on the commotion ahead. When I came to a place where I had a clear view, 2 guards stood in front of the 3 thrones populated by the royal family. The guards stood on either side of what looked to be a girl in a maid's uniform. The queen was speaking to her. "There is no chance you will be forgiven." I heard stuttering sobs from the girl who seemed to be in trouble for something. "Take her," said the queen, waving a hand lithely. "No!" the girl shouted. I knew that voice. Standing up onto my toes, I saw her struggling against the guards trying to take her through a door to the side. I gasped when I saw who it was. Haida. What could she have done? A sheen of tears lay on her face, and spit dripped from her mouth as she wept angrily. The queen had already gotten to her feet, and Fedrid and Niran followed. They watched as Haida was taken away. I wanted to stop what was happening, but I had no information. What would warrant this kind of treatment? Haida was now shouting, pulling back on the guards with every ounce of strength she had. "You have no right to be here, and you may have gotten me, but I'm not the end." One of the guards clapped a hand over her mouth, but I could still hear her muffled shrieks. A roar filled the hall as Haida seemed to have bitten the guard's hand, giving her a small window to shout one last thing. "Scavengers!" The door shut as Haida was dragged through, and other guards began pushing us out of the throne room. The royal family was already gone. I was shocked by what had just happened and allowed myself to be driven from the great room. Had Haida been arrested? What could it possibly have been for? And what did she mean by calling the royal family scavengers? I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked around to find I'd wandered toward the garden entrance. Jevon stood next to me. "Ch.11, are you okay?" I couldn't remember Jevon ever calling me Ch.11. "I heard shouting," Jevon said, turning toward the throne room. "What's going on? You look sick." Indeed, my stomach had started to churn. "I'm fine," I said. "Haida..." At the mention of Haida, Jevon met my eyes in surprise, probably not expecting it to be about her. My stomach let out a shallow moan, and I suddenly felt nauseous. "Haida? Never mind, you don't look well. Let's go to your room." His hand cautiously grabbed my far shoulder. I flinched slightly when I felt his arm along my back. We got back to my room, and I immediately ran for the washroom and emptied my evening meal into the wash basin, hanging over it for a moment after I was finished, panting, tears leaking from my eyes. Jevon was hanging back in my room. "Shay, are you all right?" Slumping down to the tiled floor, I closed my eyes, feeling better that I'd at least gotten everything out. I heard Jevin walk near me, and it sounded like he took the wash basin away. I was grateful for that. The smell had been threatening to make me sick again. Mixed with that, however, was a strange scent. I knew it. Temne root. I thought back to dinner and realized there hadn't been root bread on anyone else's table. Someone must have mixed it into the loaf. There were patches of temne root scattered around the island. It wasn't poisonous, but it would make you sick. I let out a moan. More bullying. I had something worse to think of now, though. Haida. Opening my eyes, I saw Jevin hovering in the entranceway. "Do you need me to get you something?" he asked. I shook my head, scooping a bit of water from the pool next to me and sloshing it around my mouth to remove the foul taste. I leaned and spat into the chamber pot. That was better. Jevin sat down next to me, raising a hand to rub my upper back a couple times, trying to comfort me, I supposed. It didn't really work, but he lowered it a moment later. "What was that about?" I let out a sigh, unwilling to explain everything. "Something bad at dinner." Sorry," he said. I was feeling better every second, and I thought I should continue from earlier. "Jevin, I think Haida was arrested." He was silent, and when I looked up at him, his jaw clenched tightly. "What do you mean? Your maid?" I nodded. "They were yelling, so I went to the throne room, and she was there in front of the queen. They told her she wouldn't be forgiven, and they were taking her away somewhere. She was really upset and told the royal family they didn't belong here. She said it didn't matter that they'd gotten rid of her because she wasn't the end. She called them scavengers before she was dragged away." Scavengers. Jevin was thoughtful. "I've never known Haida to break any rules. I'm not sure what she could have done to warrant any of that. Where will they take her?" "I'm not sure," said Jevin. "That is all very strange." "I know. What do you think she did?" "I've seen the queen be cruel at times," said Jevin. "Haida may have done something small and gotten punished more than was deserved." "That seems too much, even for the queen," I said. Jevin shook his head. "I really couldn't tell you, Shay. Perhaps we'll find out in the next few days. I assume everyone will be talking about it if it was that public." "You're probably right." "Are you feeling better?" He tilted his face to me, and I was transfixed at the teal symbols upon it. I wondered what he was learning in the garden. The garden. I almost forgot I had to tell Jevin about his notes. "Jevin, there's something else." "What?" His eyes widened worriedly. "I trained today and had to get your sword from your room." "What did you do, go in through the window?" I smiled. "Of course." He laughed. I continued. "But the sword was on your desk, surrounded by papers. I knocked some of them down and noticed they were notes on the garden." "Right," he said, listening closely now. "Jevin," I met his eyes now, "you can't leave those lying out in the open. If anyone found them, notes on the small handbook are one thing, as long as you keep them out of sight. Some of your notes were on more secret parts of the garden, though. You had a detailed map." I didn't want to sound like I was blaming him. "I need to learn it. I need to learn it quickly." His eyes were steeped with an anger I didn't often see, gleaming like his sword. "I know. Sorry, I should have said something earlier. We've been going over so much, I suppose I neglected the secrecy parts." I sighed. "I am sorry, but you can't make maps of the garden or take notes on the plants there. Most of those are secret as well. Many are special varieties." Jevin looked down at his knees. I suppose I understand." "Jevin, I had to burn them." Sorry, I couldn't have anyone finding them. He seemed slightly shocked at this, meeting my eyes again, then resigned. I understand. I should have realized. And I should have told you. It's my fault. Jevin was silent for a couple minutes at this. I was still feeling a bit weak, but I mustered up my strength to ask, "How are you? Are you all right?" Jevin's long fingers flexed. "There's just so much to learn." He said it almost to himself. Today was overwhelming. We began to talk of how to care for the tree. I had no idea it was so much work. I nodded. It's the only one for a reason. At times, I think she probably wasn't meant to grow on an island like ours. We have to take great care so she can thrive. And the rituals, we learned one today. Oh? It was quite complicated. This time I didn't speak, though I don't think Jevin realized. I had only learned small, simple rituals. I would have been taught the full ones when I became a full-time gardener at 20, but Jevin was learning them already? I suppose I'll learn it all soon enough. It's more difficult when I can't write it down. I'm sure it is. Jevin seemed like he needed help. I suppose you could ask my father to study in the garden handbook inside the garden. You may even be able to take notes and keep them there if that would help. Jevin yawned and said quietly, "I think he did mention that at some point, actually. I'll try asking tomorrow." My hands were clasped in my lap, and I stared at the firelight dancing over them. Jevin was quiet, and a moment later, his head fell sideways onto my shoulder. He'd fallen asleep. His dreadlocks brushed my face gently, and I smiled. I looked around his head to his face. Lines stood out clear under his eyes, and his face looked worried. It was clear he hadn't been sleeping much. It would do him no good to sleep here, though. I shook my shoulder slowly to wake him. He let out a groan and raised his eyes up to me, disoriented. "What?" "You were asleep." He hesitated a moment, then closed his eyes again. "You should have left me." I leaned back, drawing my shoulder out from under his head, which dipped for a moment before he brought it back up, sighing. "You need to go to your room and sleep," he moaned. Fine." He shook his head, and I leaned forward again to sit next to him. "All these years I thought you were just watering plants, but there's so much more to being a keeper of the garden." "I hope you're still up to the job," I said, half joking. "Me too," he said seriously. "I'm going to go to bed too. I need sleep." Jevin rose from the floor and reached out a hand to help me up. I took it, and he pulled me towards him. I let go of his hand and stood on my own. "You'll figure it out," I said, pushing him toward the door out to the hallway. "Good night." He didn't look back, but waved as he walked. I lay down in my bed. Jevin was learning the rituals now. I didn't want to admit it, but I was feeling worse and worse about him being in the garden. Why had I been chosen as a wild soul? If I had been matched, at least I would still have been a master gardener. Now I would be an apprentice forever, going around and helping Jevin when he was the master. He would surpass me, learning things I would never be allowed to learn. I let out a breath, convincing myself to relax. I had to take things one at a time. Why was I worrying? I'd be back in the garden soon, and all would be fine. I was still a part of the garden, and I wouldn't let my jealousy stop me from doing my own duties as a keeper. Smoothing my brow, I did my best to sleep.